this. Tonight is the last day of August of 2022. And we are continuing to look at the sixth point of the mind trainings. Which are called various things, but in the Jamgon Control book, they're called the commitments of mind training. And last week we talked about giving up hope for results, give up any hope for fruition. And this evening we're turning our attention onto the one that says, give up poisoned food. And I'm going to use three teachers this evening. One is that Jamgon Control, and the other one is Alan Wallace, and the third is Thich Nhat Hanh. Jamgon Control, he who is always pithy, says this: since all virtuous thoughts and actions, motivated by clinging to a concrete reality or to a self-cherishing attitude, are like poisoned food, give them up. Learn not to cling, but to know the phantom-like nature of experience. So a lot there in that little tiny paragraph. You notice he didn't say, since all non-virtuous thoughts and actions motivated by clinging are like poison food. He said even virtuous ones, if they're motivated by clinging and a desire to get something or avoid something or have things be it our way, they're like poison food, he says. Know the phantom-like nature of experience. See all phenomena as like a dream. So he takes us right back there to the second point in the meditative instructions. And also speaks to the self-cherishing attitude, the clinging to a concrete reality, that the focus of the practice is on learning to, learning might be the wrong word, to let that go, to begin to cherish others, to not need things to be as we think we need to have them all the time, and so on. So very brief, but again, chock full. And a very broad stroke, you know, how do you do that? B. Alan Wallace says, avoid poisonous food. One can gain intellectual understanding of Dharma by reading and receiving teachings, and one can begin to gain some experience by putting the teachings into practice. But as a result, we may begin to feel we are superior to others, a theme I've mentioned before. This feeling of I am special is the poisonous food mentioned in this aphorism. Of course, when Jamgon Control said it, it wasn't that specific. But a number of teachers kind of point to spiritual arrogance in a way as the poisonous food that this is being referred to. And there are a number of other slogans that speak to that also. He then enlarges on that. His final short paragraph is, the goal of spiritual practice is to overcome self-grasping and self-centeredness. If our goal is actually to feel more important than anyone else in the world, we can achieve this without any Dharma practice whatsoever. But he, like Jamgon Khantrul, again points out the goal of spiritual practice is to overcome self-grasping and self-centeredness. So give up poisonous foods. What does that mean, perhaps in a larger sense? And I think Thich Nhat Hanh addresses this in a way that really gets down to some of the practical aspects and some of the specifics of the poisonous foods that we tend to ingest, sometimes without thinking, sometimes unknowingly, and how to begin to pay more attention to that and to move in a direction that will bring less suffering to ourselves and the people around us. I'm looking now at this book, The Heart of the Buddha's Teaching by Thich Nhat Hanh. If you don't have this book, it's such a wonderful book. I would urge you to have a look. He talks about poisonous foods in a way in a chapter that really has to do with, he speaks to the second noble truth. There is a cause of suffering, and he's saying, here's a big part of it right here, is what you ingest. And he refers to these things as the Four Nutriments. And the Four Nutriments are edible food, sense impressions, intention or volition, interesting thought, and consciousness. And of course that word can mean so many things, but he gets specific about it, we'll get to that. So he says this, the first nutriment is edible food. So he gets very concrete. What we eat or drink can bring about mental or physical suffering. We must be able to distinguish between what is healthful and what is harmful. So this goes well beyond eating actual poison. We need to practice right view when we shop, cook, and eat. Skipping ahead just a little bit. Much of our suffering comes from not eating mindfully. So there's another way of having actual physical food be poisonous in a way, according to Thai, according to Thich Nhat Hanh, is not eating mindfully. We have to learn ways to eat that preserve the health and self-being and the well-being of our body and our spirit. When we smoke, drink, or consume toxins, he says, we are eating our own lungs, liver, and heart. So he, bam, goes right to it. And there's an even more pithy example that I didn't read. You can look it up yourself if you're interested. We have to look deeply to see how we grow our food, so we can eat in ways that preserve our collective well-being, minimize our suffering and the suffering of other species, and allow the earth to continue to be a source of life for all of us. He has a few other things to say about that, but we'll move along to the second one here now. The second kind of nutriment is sense impressions. Our 6 organs, ears, eyes, nose, tongue, body, and mind, are in constant contact with sense objects. Is that not true? I mean, it's always there. And these contacts become food for our consciousness. When we drive through a city, our eyes see so many billboards, and these images enter our consciousness. When we pick up a magazine, the articles and advertisements are food for our consciousness. Advertisements that stimulate our craving for possessions, sex, and food can be toxic, poisonous. If, after reading the newspaper, hearing the news, or being in a conversation, we feel anxious or worn out, we know we have been in contact with toxins. Interesting thought. A sort of self-monitoring check. You've done something and boy, at the end of it, you really feel wrung out. What was it that you were ingesting that resulted in that feeling? Movies are food for our eyes, ears, and minds. When we watch TV, the program is our food. He talks a bit about children, and how the effect on them when they spend so much of their time looking at the screens and all it brings them. We are exposed to so many forms, colors, sounds, smells, tastes, objects of touch, and ideas that are toxic and rob our body and consciousness of their well-being. When you feel despair, fear, or depression, it may be because you've ingested too many toxins through your sense impressions. Not only children need to be protected from violent and unwholesome films, TV programs, books, magazines, and games. We too can be destroyed by these media. He mentioned the news, and of course we all know how toxic that can be. He also makes it very clear that being in touch with the suffering of the other beings in the world through the news and other sources is important. So with many of these things, it's a balance. It's not all or none, and it really does get down to our own discernment of what is a toxin for us, in which circumstances. And he says, if we're mindful, we'll know whether we're ingesting the toxins of fear, hatred, and violence, or eating foods that encourage understanding, compassion, and the determination to help others. With the practice of mindfulness, we will know that hearing this, looking at that, or touching this, we feel light and peaceful. While hearing that, looking at this, or touching that, we feel anxious, sad, or depressed. As a result, we will know what to be in contact with and what to avoid. And again, in case you're misunderstanding at all, Thai does not encourage anyone to wrap a cocoon around themselves and avoid all contact with things that are difficult to see, and encourages full participation in the world in terms of helping relieving the suffering of the world, which very often does involve a lot of contact with things that are very difficult and painful to see, hear, and touch, so forth. How are we doing here? We're not doing very well at all time-wise. He mentions the 5 mindfulness trainings can be very helpful in this regard, and those are the 5 precepts of not harming, not stealing, not using toxins. There we are right here on that one. Appropriate sexual activity, and right speech. The third kind of nutriment is volition, intention, or will. The desire in us to obtain whatever it is that we want. Volition is the ground of all our actions. So volition, of course, applies to the first 2 nutriments. If we think that the way for us to be happy is to become president of a large corporation, everything we do or say will be directed toward realizing that goal. Even when we sleep, our consciousness will continue to work on it. Isn't that true? When we're really intent on something, it shows up in our dreams, it does happen. Or suppose we believe that all our suffering and the suffering of our family has been brought about by someone who wronged us in the past. Our life is motivated by the desire for revenge, and everything we say and plan is to punish that person. We think this will liberate us from our anger and hatred. So he again uses pretty extreme examples, but you get the idea that if your volition in a large sense is aimed at something that really occupies you and drives, if that's your aspiration, it's kind of what it gets down to, isn't it? If your aspiration is that, it's going to drive you in ways, it's a toxin, it'll drive you in ways that are unhealthy. Everyone wants to be happy, and there is a strong energy in us pushing us toward what we think will make us happy, but we may suffer a lot because of this. We need the insight that position, revenge, wealth, fame, or possessions are more often than not obstacles to our happiness. We need to cultivate the wish to be free of these things so we can enjoy the wonders of life that are always available, the blue sky, the trees, our beautiful children. I can just hear his voice now. After 3 months or 6 months of mindful eating, mindful walking, and mindful looking, a deep vision of reality arises in us, and the capacity of being there, enjoying life in the present moment, liberates us from all impulses and brings us real happiness. You've all heard this one, but I'm going to read it anyway. One day after the Buddha and the group of monks finished eating lunch mindfully together, a farmer, very agitated, came by and asked, "Monks, have you seen my cows? I don't think I can survive so much misfortune." The Buddha asked him, "What happened?" The man said, "Monks, this morning all 12 of my cows ran away, and this year my whole crop of sesame plants was eaten by insects." The Buddha said, "Sir, we have not seen your cows. Perhaps they have gone in the other direction." After the farmer went off in that direction, the Buddha turned to his Sangha and said, "Dear friends, do you know you are the happiest people on earth? You have no cows and no sesame plants to lose." We always try to accumulate more and more, and we think these cows are essential for our existence. And our volition, our will, our intention is focused on these things. So he's bringing it down to that aspect of what causes this collecting. In fact, they may be obstacles to prevent us from being happy. Release your cows and become a free person. That should be written down, a little sign. Release your cows and become a free person. Release your cows so you can be truly happy. And the food of consciousness is the fourth of the 4 kinds of food. There are 2 kinds of consciousness, the collective and the individual. The food of consciousness means that we consume consciousness. There are different kinds of consciousness food. Some are healthy and nutritive, and some are toxic. In the collective consciousness, there are many toxic foods, such as anger and despair. If we allow ourselves to consume that kind of food, we shall be poisoned. So we should not spend time close to or in a community that has a great deal of hatred and despair. We need to find a collective consciousness to be with that is not filled with hatred and despair, where all day long the people who live there just think about compassion and helping others. So he's putting a plug in there for Sangha. And for monastic Sanghas, for that matter. The individual consciousness also has toxins. The hells, hungry ghosts, and animal realms are in us. If we want them to appear, they can appear right away. We only need to press a button and Pandora's box will open. If we sit there and allow the negative thinking connected to past experiences to come up, we are eating the toxic matter of consciousness. Many of us sit and think, and the more we think, the more angry, upset, and in despair we become. So this is such a simple example. Allowing the negative thoughts connected to our past experiences to come up. You know, we do that without even a thought very often. We just start thinking about that thing that happened and how bad it was. And he's really suggesting, you know, we need to be aware when that happens. And that puts us in a position to decide whether we want to continue with that. I think this one, well, speaking personally, for me, this is probably the most tricky one. My mind brings up all kinds of stuff. I even think, where the heck did that come from? You know, none of us get to choose what pops up into our minds. And it may well be something that happened in the past that we don't feel good about. And it may also be something in the future that we're worried about. And we have no control over that. You know, there it is. So, you know, the practice gets down to recognizing, oh, that's happening right now. And what do I want to do? It's that same thing, the second thought practice. We have no control over the first thought. It simply arises in the mind. We have control over the second thought. Okay, I see the first thought now. What shall I do? Do I want to really go down that same old, you know, some of these things that come up, we've gone down the same road a number of times. We have the same little story goes through our mind. So do I really want to do that? Let's see. Well, I'll just read it like he says. Nevertheless, in our consciousness, besides the seeds of the gods, the asuras, the hell realms, the hungry ghosts, and the animals, those are the other 5 realms, not the human realm, but they're all in us, he says, are the seeds of hearer, disciples, self-achieved Buddhas, bodhisattvas, and fully enlightened Buddhas. Those are all specific states of being that are described in the Buddhist literature. We have as many channels in our consciousness as a multi-channel television. Why do we not push the button of the Buddha or the Bodhisattva channel? Sitting alone, we push on the hungry ghost, the one that wants and never gets enough, or we push on the animals that, you know, attack and eat and so forth. Just like the ruminants chew the cud. In the past, we've experienced hatred, we have been abused and maltreated. All these, who hasn't been, right? All these events have been buried in our consciousness, and we have not been able to transform them. We chew the cud of our suffering, our despair, like the cows chew the regurgitated grass. There's a good image. You know, we bring it up and chew it again. Every time we think about being abused, we are abused once again. But in actuality, that is not happening now. It is all over. Thinking like this, we can be abused every day, even though our childhood may have had a great deal of happiness and sweet moments. We ruminate on our hatred, suffering, and despair, and it is not healthy food. And again, I just want to put something in there. He is not suggesting that we do not examine the past as a pathway to healing and transformation. And he teaches very deeply on the subject of past trauma and how to deal with it. That does not involve trying to push it away, pretend it didn't happen, or change the channel. So I just want to say that sometimes I think he gets seen as someone who is all sweetness and light, but he goes to the tough stuff. He really does, and he encourages others to do the same, and he's very specific about it. So, what does he say here now? There are many practices that can help us face our suffering, including mindful walking, mindful breathing, mindful sitting, mindful eating, mindful looking, mindful listening. One mindful step can take us deep into the realization of beauty and joy in us and around us. Tran Thai Tong, a great meditation master of 13th century Vietnam, said, "With every step, you touch the ground of reality." When the cause of suffering has been seen, healing is possible. We vow to refrain from ingesting foods that make us suffer, and we also vow to ingest foods that are healthy and wholesome. So I'll stop there. Those are Thai's thoughts on the Four Nutriments, which I thought really speak to give up eating poisonous food, to really be aware of all the varieties that poisonous food can take. All the way from what we actually put in our mouth, all the way through what we're thinking. And that we do have a choice. We have a lot of old habit energy. It's not like we can flip a switch and all of a sudden it's all different. The choice continues to come up each time we decide to do something. There's the volition, or have a thought arise in our mind. There's the consciousness. And we can be increasingly aware of what those old habit energies are and how they're not good for us. So it gets down to, okay, there it is. Once again, there's the old habit energy arisen of irritation or frustration or anxiety or feelings of confusion, jealousy or whatever it might be. And they tend to kick into old tapes, as we used to say in the mental health field. And we run them. And what Thai and these other teachers are all saying is we don't have to. The key to it is mindfulness of mind. That we're aware of what's arising. We can see it clearly. And we are then in a position to do any number of things that might be more helpful than simply going down the same path again. When we do that, and then eventually thinking about that whole thing goes away. It's down into the part of our mind that we are not aware of as conscious agents. At some point, it's going to come up again. But it's going to come up again in a way that's different than before because of what we did differently the last time. And it gives us the opportunity to once again do something differently. And each time we do that, the transformation process continues. That's how transformation occurs very often. It's these just very gradual, each time it comes around, treat it differently. Comes back down, it's different, comes back up, now affected by the previous. And my experience of watching these things in myself is eventually they kind of quit coming up. Or when they come up, they're no longer rah, they're no longer heavy duty. They're kind of like, oh yeah. Even with a kind of a sense of humor about it. I know that one. It's an old friend. It doesn't really have any effect on me anymore. So not eating poisonous food is a big part of the transformative process. So I will stop and press the button once again.